Simone Ashford had a habit of deciding what a person was worth before they finished their first sentence, and she had already decided about the man standing at the edge of her construction site with a canvas bag over his shoulder and grease under his fingernails. "You're the independent," she said. It wasn't a question. She had read his name off a clipboard 40 seconds earlier and already regretted approving the contract. Julian Reyes nodded once. He didn't offer his hand, because he had noticed she hadn't offered hers, and he had spent enough of his life reading rooms to know when an introduction was a formality rather than an invitation. Behind her, 20 engineers stood in a loose crescent across the 60th floor of the Meridian Spire, the building that was supposed to be the tallest residential tower in the Midwest, the building that was supposed to open in 11 weeks, and the building that had, for the last 6 days, been vibrating at a frequency none of them could explain. The vibration wasn't visible. It wasn't even something most people could feel with their hands. But the sensors picked it estemos every night between 2 and 4 in the morning, a rhythmic shudder running through the steel skeleton. Something breathing underneath the concrete, and no one on Ashford Group's payroll had been able to say why. Simone had flown in her own structural team from 3 cities. She had brought in a firm from Chicago that specialized in high-rise vibration analysis. She had spent, by her own estimate, $400,000 in the last week alone on consultants who had produced reports full of graphs and no answers. And now, because her father had insisted, because Augustus Ashford still believed in things like reputation and word of mouth over credentials, she was standing in front of a man who ran a 2-person structural inspection outfit out of a converted garage on the south side. "You have 4 hours," she said. "After that, I need this floor cleared for the concrete crew, whether you've found something or not." Julian looked past her at the steel column nearest the elevator core, the one the vibration reports kept circling without naming. "I'll need 6, he said. A young engineer near the back of the group, a woman with a laminated badge that still had the shine of someone who'd graduated within the year, opened her mouth as if she meant to say something. Then she looked at the man beside her, older, tired, wearing an Ashford Group polo with the kind of permanence that comes from a decade of employment, and closed her mouth again. She had run the same vibration numbers Julian was about to run. She had a theory. She had not said it out loud in a meeting where Desmond Voss was present, because 6 weeks ago another engineer had said something Desmond didn't want to hear and was reassigned to a site in Milwaukee within the month. Desmond Voss stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the stairwell, hands in his coat pockets, watching the exchange with the stillness of a man who had already decided how it would end. He was the company's chief operating officer, and he had run every major project Ashford Group had built in the last 12 years, and he did not think highly of contractors who arrived without a firm and without a track record he could look up. "With respect," Desmond said, in the tone of a man who intended no respect at all, "we've had 3 certified firms on this floor already. I'm not sure what 6 hours with a garage inspector is going to add." Julian didn't answer him directly. He set his bag down, opened it, and pulled out a small handheld device with a cracked screen, the kind of tool that looked like it had been dropped more than once and repaired more than that. He walked to the base of the column near the elevator core, the one nobody had named, and pressed the sensor flat against the steel. "You've been reading the vibration as a structural issue," he said, mostly to himself, though the whole crescent of engineers could hear him. Might not be. Might be something feeding into the structure instead of coming from it. Simone's arms were crossed. She checked her watch, a habit that had nothing to do with the time and everything to do with reminding everyone in the room how little of it she had. She had a call with Aurelius Capital in 9 days to finalize the financing round that would let her break ground on the second tower, and Aurelius had made it clear, gently but unmistakably, that a structural delay on the flagship project would not inspire confidence. 6 hours, she said. "And if you find nothing, I'm billing your firm for the concrete crew's overtime." "Fair," Julian said, and meant it. He worked the way he always worked, which was quietly, without narration, without the performance some inspectors put on for an audience that expected drama for the money they were paying. He moved along the column base, then up the stairwell to the 61st floor. Listening to the steel with a stethoscope-like device pressed against welded joints, pausing every few feet the way a doctor pauses on a chest that doesn't sound quite right. He didn't explain what he was listening for. He didn't need the room to understand him, he needed the steel to. By the second hour, most of the crescent of engineers had drifted back to their own tasks, checked their phones, gone to lunch. Desmond had not left. He stood near the stairwell with his coat still on, watching Julian work with the patience of a man waiting for a failure he was confident would arrive. It was the young engineer, the one with the laminated badge, who stayed the longest. Her name was Priya Nakamura, and she had been the safety supervisor's assistant for 11 months, long enough to have filed 2 reports about the vibration pattern herself, both of which had been closed by Desmond's office, with a note attributing the readings to seasonal thermal expansion. She watched Julian work with an attention that had nothing to do with curiosity about a stranger and everything to do with recognizing, in his silence, something she'd been trying to say out loud for weeks without anyone listening. At the 63rd floor, Julian stopped. He crouched beside a junction box mounted to the underside of a support beam, a small gray unit that fed data from 4 separate strain gauges into the building's central monitoring system. He didn't touch it. He listened to it, the way he'd listened to every weld and joint on the way up, and what he heard wasn't steel at all. It was a relay clicking on a cycle that had no business existing in a passive monitoring system. On, off, on, every 4 seconds exactly. "That's not supposed to draw power," he said quietly. Priya, who had followed him up 2 floors without being asked, stopped walking. "What isn't?" Julian didn't answer right away. He pulled a small mirror from his bag, angled it into the narrow gap behind the junction box, and went still in a way that made Priya's stomach tighten before she understood why. There was a second device behind the first. Smaller. Not part of any schematic she had ever seen for this floor. She opened her mouth to ask what it was. Julian held up one hand. Not sharply. Just enough to ask for a moment of quiet. The way a man asks for silence when he's trying to hear something under a sound that's already loud. Down the stairwell, faint but unmistakable, she heard the elevator arrive on 62. Someone was coming up. Julian closed his bag, Julian Gliingwimba, and looked at Priya with an expression she would spend the rest of the week trying to interpret. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man confirming something he'd suspected before he ever set foot on this floor. "Don't mention the junction box," he said. "Not yet. Not to anyone." Footsteps reached the top of the stairwell. Desmond Voss stepped through the door, checking his watch with the same performative impatience Simone had used 2 hours earlier, and looked at the 2 of them standing beside a support beam with an expression that made it clear he'd expected to find nothing, and was already annoyed that he hadn't. 4 hours left, Desmond said. "I'd start narrowing it down, if I were you." Julian stood, closed his bag the rest of the way, and said nothing about what he'd found. He'd learned a long time ago, in a courtroom 11 years earlier, exactly what happened to a man who said what he'd found before he understood who wanted it to stay hidden. The second device behind the junction box was a signal repeater, small enough to fit in a closed fist, wired into the strain gauge feed with a splice that had been done cleanly, professionally, by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and did not want it found. Julian didn't remove it. He photographed it through the gap with the mirror still in place, logged the floor and the joint number in a notebook he kept for exactly this purpose, and said nothing to Desmond Voss beyond a request for another hour. He got the hour. He used 40 minutes of it on the 64th floor, tracing conduit runs that shouldn't have existed on the building's official schematics, and the last 20 on the 60th floor, standing in front of the column near the elevator core that the vibration reports kept circling without naming. This time he brought a portable ultrasonic scanner, the kind of equipment that cost more than his truck, borrowed from a colleague in Milwaukee who owed him a favor from a bridge inspection 2 years back. He ran the scanner slowly along the weld seam at the column's base, And on the fourth pass, the readout flattened in a way that shouldn't have been possible for a joint rated to carry the load this one was supposed to carry. The weld had been ground and resurfaced, not repaired. Cosmetically restored, the way a body shop buffs out a scratch without touching the dent underneath. Whatever had originally been wrong with that joint, someone had made it look fine to a visual inspection and a passing glance from a camera, without addressing whatever fault had made the resurfacing necessary in the first place. Julian sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then, he packed his bag and went to find Simone. She was in the site trailer at the base of the tower, on a call with someone from Aurelius Capital, her voice carrying the particular brightness people use when they are working very hard to sound like nothing is wrong. She held up one finger when Julian appeared in the doorway, finished the call with a promise to follow up by Thursday, and set the phone down with the controlled exhale of someone counting silently to 5 before speaking. "Tell me you found something that isn't going to cost me the financing round." "I found 2 things," Julian said. "One of them is a weld at the base of the column by the elevator core that's been cosmetically resurfaced to hide a defect underneath. The other one is a signal repeater spliced into your strain gauge feed on floor 63, transmitting a modified readout to your central monitoring system." Simone's face didn't move for a moment. The particular stillness of someone processing 2 sentences that each, on their own, would have been the worst thing she heard all week. "Modified how?" "I don't know yet. I'd need access to the monitoring system's historical log to compare what the gauges actually recorded against what got displayed. But someone built that repeater to sit exactly where it would intercept the signal before it reached your engineer's screens. That's not a manufacturing defect. That's a decision somebody made. You're telling me someone sabotaged my building. I'm telling you someone's been controlling what your building tells you about itself. Whether that's sabotage or something more specific, I can't say yet." Desmond arrived in the doorway before Simone could respond, having apparently been informed by someone on the floor that the independent inspector had come down early. He looked between the two of them with the expression of a man recalibrating his estimate of how much trouble this was going to be. "What's the finding?" he said. Not a question. A demand for a summary he could manage. Julian repeated what he'd told Simone in the same flat sequence, without adjusting the delivery for the fact that Desmond's jaw had tightened at the mention of the strain gauge splice specifically, a full half-second before Julian had finished the sentence describing it. Julian noticed. He filed it the way he filed everything, without comment, and kept talking. "I'd like access to the monitoring system's raw data going back 30 days, he said. "And I'd like to know who had physical access to the 63rd floor mechanical run in the last 2 weeks. "That's a significant ask," Desmond said. "You're a contractor we hired 6 hours ago. You hired me because 3 certified firms and $400,000 of consulting didn't find what I just found in 6 hours, Julian said, without any heat in it at all. "I'd think that would buy a little access." Simone looked at Desmond for a long moment, the kind of look that carried a decade of working relationship behind it, and something Julian couldn't quite name underneath that. "Give him the log access," she said. 60 days, not 30. I want to see the pattern before it started, not just after. Desmond's expression flattened into something professionally neutral. "I'll have IT pull it. It'll take a day. By tomorrow morning," Simone said. He left without agreeing to the timeline out loud, which both of them noticed, and neither of them commented on. The strain gauge history arrived at 9 the next morning, delivered not by IT but by Priya Nakamura, who found Julian in the site trailer with a laptop and a stack of printed floor plans and set the drive down on the table without being asked twice. "Desmond wanted to review it first," she said. "I told him you needed it for the 10 o'clock walkthrough. That bought about 4 hours before he'll notice I already gave it to you." Julian looked at her for a moment before taking the drive. "Why help me?" Priya hesitated, and in the hesitation was something that Julian, who had spent 11 years learning to read exactly this kind of pause, recognized immediately. It wasn't the pause of someone deciding whether to trust a stranger. It was the pause of someone who had already decided something much larger, much earlier, and was now trying to figure out how much of it to say out loud. "I filed 2 reports about the vibration pattern," she said, instead of answering. "Both closed as thermal expansion. I know what thermal expansion looks like on a strain gauge readout. This isn't it." It wasn't the answer to his question. Julian noticed that too, and let it go. Because a person who wasn't ready to say something rarely became more ready for being pushed. The 60 days of data told him what he'd suspected, and confirmed a shape he hadn't expected. The vibration pattern hadn't started 6 days ago. It had started 11 weeks earlier, at a low amplitude that wouldn't have triggered any alert threshold, and it had been increasing gradually since, in small enough increments that no single day's reading looked alarming next to the day before it. Someone had either engineered a fault to develop slowly, or someone had known about a fault that was already developing slowly and had built a system to keep it hidden until it crossed a threshold they controlled. The repeater spliced into the strain gauge feed had been installed. According to the maintenance access log Priya had also included on the drive, on a Tuesday 11 weeks and 2 days earlier. The same week the vibration first appeared in the raw data. Julian sat with that for a long moment, the trailer quiet except for the hum of the laptop fan, and felt something settle into place that he didn't like at all. This wasn't a defect somebody was trying to cover up after the fact. This was a defect somebody had built in on purpose, and then constructed a monitoring blind spot to keep concealed for exactly as long as they needed it concealed. The question that mattered wasn't what the fault was anymore. It was who needed the building's opening delayed, and by how much, and why 11 weeks was the number they'd chosen. Desmond found him at noon, in the stairwell between floors 60 and 61, and the conversation that followed was the first one in which Julian understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. "I did some reading on you last night," Desmond said, leaning against the railing with the ease of a man delivering information he'd been saving. Illinois v. Reyes. Structural inspector convicted of falsifying safety records on the Delacroix pedestrian bridge. 18 months served. Interesting resume for a man Simone's trusting with 60 stories of steel. Julian didn't flinch, because he had known this was coming since the moment he'd walked onto the site, and a thing you have braced for 11 years doesn't land the same way a surprise does. "I didn't falsify anything," Julian said. "The bolts was substandard. I flagged it. The paperwork got signed off above my authorization level by someone protecting a construction schedule. And when the bridge failed, it was easier to blame the inspector who couldn't afford a defense attorney than the executive who could." "That's certainly one version," Desmond said. "It's the only version that's true. The conviction got overturned 2 years after I served the sentence, when the executive's own emails came out in a civil suit. You can look that up too, if you did any reading at all." Something in Desmond's expression shifted. Very briefly. A flicker of recalculation that suggested he had, in fact, not looked that far. He recovered quickly. "The point," Desmond said, "is that a man with your history walks onto my site, finds a convenient conspiracy involving hidden devices and secret splices, and somehow positions himself as the only person who can uncover it. I've seen that story before. It usually ends with the inspector negotiating a settlement. I haven't asked for a settlement. Not yet." Julian let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again, because he had learned, in a courtroom a long time ago, that the loudest thing a person could do in a moment like this was refuse to fill a silence with a defense nobody had asked for yet. "You knew about the splice date before I told you," Julian said. 11 weeks and 2 days. I only mentioned the strain gauge repeater. I never gave you a timeline." Desmond's jaw tightened. It was a small thing, barely a fraction of a second, and if Julian hadn't spent 11 years learning to hear the half-second lag in a machine that was compensating for something wrong underneath, he might have missed it entirely. "I have people who brief me," Desmond said, and pushed off the railing and walked down the stairwell without waiting for a response. Priya came to find him again that evening, after the crew had cleared out and the 60th floor sat empty and lit by a single string of work lights strung along the exposed steel. She stood at the edge of the frame, not quite entering the space where Julian was crouched beside the resurfaced weld, taking measurements with a caliper he'd borrowed from the site's tool crib. "Desmond's asked me to compile a timeline of your access to the 63rd floor," she said, "for a report he's putting together for legal." Julian didn't look up. "When?" he asked. "This afternoon. Wants it by end of day tomorrow." "That's fast. For a report to legal." "It is," Priya said. And then, in the tone of someone deciding, finally, to say something she'd been holding for longer than a day, "There's a supply closet on 58. Desmond's had 2 meetings there this week with someone from outside the company. I don't know who. I know it's not on his calendar." Julian set the caliper down slowly. "How do you know about the meetings if they're not on his calendar?" Priya's answer arrived a beat too fast, the way an answer arrives when it has been prepared in advance rather than discovered in the moment. "I saw them going in," she said. "Both times." She turned and walked toward the stairwell before Julian could ask the question that had already formed, the one about how a safety supervisor's assistant happened to be positioned twice to witness a private meeting on a floor she had no operational reason to visit. He watched her go, and filed the detail the way he filed everything, without comment, though this one sat differently than the others, because the timeline she'd just described didn't fit the shape of an ally offering help. It fit the shape of someone who had been watching Desmond closely enough and long enough to know exactly which detail would sound most alarming if she said it out loud at exactly the right moment. The accusation came in front of 11 people, at 7 in the morning, before Julian had finished his coffee. Desmond called it an emergency safety briefing, held in the site trailer with the blinds drawn against the gray Chicago morning, and by the time Julian walked in, he understood from the seating arrangement alone that the meeting had been built around him. Simone sat at the head of the table. Desmond stood beside a monitor at the far wall. Priya sat near the back, next to the young engineer with the laminated badge, both of them very still. "We pulled the maintenance access logs for the 63rd floor mechanical run," Desmond said, without preamble, and turned the monitor toward the room. "Going back 4 months, not 60 days. 4 months. The screen showed a table of time-stamped entries, badge numbers, floor access codes. Desmond highlighted one line in red. "Read Aeroservice," he said, then caught himself, then corrected it with the faint irritation of a man who'd prepared the wrong file at some point and hadn't fully purged the muscle memory. "Reyes Structural Consulting. Badge access to floor 63, 3 weeks before this contract officially began. Before Simone signed you on. Before you had any business being anywhere near this building." The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it has been told something it doesn't yet know how to react to. Julian didn't move. "I've never had badge access to this site before yesterday. The log says otherwise." Desmond turned the monitor further, so the whole table could see it clearly. "It says, you were on 63 for 40 minutes, at 11 at night, 3 weeks ago, which happens to be within the window our forensic timeline places the strain gauge repeater's installation." Simone's expression didn't change, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, tightened at the knuckles. She looked at Julian the way a person looks at someone they have started to trust, and are now being told, with documentation, that the trust was a mistake. "Julian," she said, carefully, "is there an explanation?" "Someone cloned my badge," Julian said, "or forged the log entry. I wasn't in this building 3 weeks ago. I was in Milwaukee, inspecting a bridge deck for the county, and I have an invoice with a timestamp that puts me there for 6 hours that night." "Convenient," Desmond said. "It's convenient because it's true," Julian said. And for the first time since he'd arrived on the site, there was an edge in his voice. Not loud, but present. "You said read Aeroservice a moment ago. I don't run an Aeroservice company. I've never run one. That's not a slip of the tongue, Desmond. That's a name from a different file." A flicker crossed Desmond's face, gone almost as fast as it arrived, but the young engineer near the back caught it too, and Julian saw her glance sideways at Priya with the particular look of someone who has just noticed a crack in a wall they'd assumed was solid. Priya didn't return the glance. She was looking at the table. "The point," Desmond said, recovering, "is that we have a documented history of falsified safety findings from this contractor, and now a badge log placing him at the exact location of the sabotage weeks before the incident became public. I'd suggest, for the safety of everyone in this building, that we suspend his access pending a full legal review." Simone was quiet for a long moment. Julian watched her weigh it, watched the calculation happen behind her eyes, the same calculation that had made her hesitate over the emergency call from her own father a day earlier, the unwillingness to believe that someone she had worked beside for over a decade could be capable of this, set against a stack of paperwork that said otherwise. "Hold his site access," she said finally, "until we verified the log against the badge system's physical audit trail. Not suspended. Held. That's different. And I want everyone in this room to understand the difference." Desmond's jaw worked once, a small motion, before he nodded. Julian handed over his access badge without argument because he had learned a long time ago, in a courtroom that had not been kind to him, exactly what it looked like when an innocent man argued too hard in the moment an accusation was made. He said nothing further. He walked out of the trailer into the gray morning light and did not look back to see who was watching him go, though he knew, without needing to look, that at least one person in that room had wanted to speak and hadn't. Priya found him 2 hours later at a diner 4 blocks from the site, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never seemed to empty, and she slid into the seat across from him without asking whether she was welcome. "I have something," she said. "I don't know if it's enough." She set her phone on the table, screen up, and pushed it toward him. It was a photograph, taken from a distance, slightly out of focus, showing 2 men standing near a service entrance on the building's lower level. One of them was Desmond. The other man Julian didn't recognize, mid-50s, wearing a coat too formal for a construction site, carrying a leather case. "Who is he?" Julian asked. "I don't know his name. I've seen him twice. Both times he came in through the service entrance, not the main lobby, and both times Desmond met him alone." Priya's hand was resting flat on the table, and Julian noticed she wasn't quite meeting his eyes. "I should have said something sooner. I've had this photo for 6 days. Why didn't you?" The question sat between them for a long moment, and Julian watched her decide, the way he had watched people decide things his entire career, that the moment for half-answers had passed. 4 years ago, I was a junior engineer on a parking structure project in Denver," she said. "I flagged a rebar spacing issue in the second-level slab. My supervisor told me it was within tolerance. I believed him because he had 15 years on me and I had 11 months. 6 weeks after we opened, a section of that slab partially failed. Nobody died. 2 cars were destroyed, and a maintenance worker broke his arm." She turned the phone screen off, though she didn't pick it up. "I've spent 4 years telling myself that if I'd pushed harder, if I'd gone over my supervisor's head, instead of accepting his answer, it wouldn't have happened. So when I saw the vibration pattern here, I told myself I wasn't going to be the person who stayed quiet again. But you did stay quiet. For 6 days. Because the first time I pushed, I destroyed my own career for 18 months while everyone decided whether to believe me. I watched what happened to you happen because you didn't have a photograph. I didn't want to hand Desmond a reason to make sure I never worked in this industry again before I had something he couldn't explain away." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. Not with forgiveness exactly, because there was nothing to forgive, but with the particular recognition of someone who understood the arithmetic of that fear better than almost anyone alive. "The badge log," he said. "You could clear that in 10 minutes if you had physical access to the audit trail server." "I do have access." Priya's hand curled into a fist on the table, then released. "I haven't pulled it yet. If I pull it and it clears you, Desmond will know exactly who did it. and I'll be the second person on this project he decides to make disappear. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not. She looked up at him finally, and there was something steady in it now. Something that hadn't been there a minute earlier. I'm telling you I'm going to anyway. She pulled the audit trail that evening from a terminal in the site office that logged every access request by user, and the physical badge scanner data told a story the digital log hadn't. The badge reader at the 63rd floor stairwell recorded a hardware signature for every scan, a serial number embedded in the chip that couldn't be forged by editing a database entry, only by physically cloning the badge itself. Julian's badge, issued the previous morning, carried a hardware signature that had been manufactured 6 days earlier and had never been activated before his contract began. Whoever had entered the badge number into the log 3 weeks ago hadn't used Julian's actual badge, because Julian's actual badge hadn't existed yet. They'd entered a fabricated hardware signature into the digital record without understanding that the physical scanner system kept an independent chain of custody the digital log alone couldn't fake. It was, Priya said, looking at the mismatch on her screen at 9 that night, the kind of mistake made by someone who understood software and didn't understand hardware, or someone in a hurry. She sent the finding to Simone directly, bypassing Desmond's office with a note explaining the discrepancy in plain technical language, and copied Julian on the message as a courtesy, and then sat in the empty site office for a long time afterward, aware that she had just done the thing she'd spent 6 days telling herself she wasn't ready to do. Simone called an emergency meeting for the next morning, smaller this time. Just Julian, Priya, and herself, in a conference room on the 2nd floor, and she read the audit trail report twice before she spoke. "This clears you," she said to Julian. "It doesn't clear anyone else. It just means someone falsified the digital log without knowing about the hardware signature. It means someone with digital access to the badge system, but not enough technical understanding to know it wasn't sufficient," Julian said. "That's a specific kind of person, not an engineer, not IT. Someone senior enough to request the change and confident enough not to ask questions about how thoroughly it would hold up." Simone was quiet. She looked at the report again, at the timestamp of the falsified entry, and something in her face shifted, the particular stillness of a person doing arithmetic they didn't want to finish. "Desmond requested a badge system audit 8 days ago," she said slowly. "I approved it. I thought it was routine. He said IT flagged some inconsistencies in the access logs and wanted to run a full reconciliation." She set the report down. He had legitimate access to modify those records. He had a legitimate reason on file for touching them. He built himself permission to falsify the log before he needed to falsify it. Julian said, "That's not someone improvising. That's someone who planned this months out." The three of them sat with that for a moment, the quiet stretching long enough that the building's ventilation system, cycling somewhere above them, became the loudest thing in the room. It was Priya who spoke next, and what she said changed the shape of everything that followed. "I need to tell you both something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before either of you reacts." Simone nodded once. Julian said nothing, which she seemed to understand as its own kind of permission. "The man in the photograph I showed Julian," Priya said. "I ran his face against a facial recognition database this morning, the kind of thing I'm not technically authorized to use for personal purposes, and I got a match. His name is Roland Ashby. He's a managing partner at a firm called Corrigan Ashby Consulting." She paused, and the pause carried weight before the words that followed it arrived. Corrigan Ashby did the third-party structural certification on the Delacroix pedestrian bridge 12 years ago. The same bridge from Julian's case. The room went very still. Julian felt something settle in his chest that was neither surprise nor relief, but a third thing entirely. Colder than both, the sensation of a door he had spent 11 years believing was permanently closed, swinging open again on hinges that had never actually rusted shut. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Corrigan Ashby Consulting," Priya repeated. "They certified the Delacroix Bridge as structurally sound, 6 weeks before it partially collapsed. The same firm that testified against you at your trial. Roland Ashby was junior counsel on their engineering team back then. He's a managing partner now. Simone looked between the two of them, understanding arriving a half-second behind the words. You're telling me the same consulting firm that helped convict Julian 11 years ago is meeting privately with my chief operating officer on my own site. I'm telling you, Priya said, that whatever is happening to this building isn't only about delaying your financing round. I don't think it's a coincidence that the man they brought in to help hide it is connected to the one person in this building who already knows, better than anyone alive, exactly how convincingly that firm can make a lie look like a certified fact. Julian stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked down at the site below. At the crane, still turning against the gray sky, at the scaffolding wrapped around floor 60 like a bandage over a wound. Nobody outside this room yet understood was still bleeding. They didn't just build a fault into this building, he said, without turning around. They built a fault they knew I'd recognize. And they made sure the story that comes out, if anyone ever finds it, points straight back at a convicted man with a documented history of exactly this kind of failure. He turned back to face them, and the calm that had carried him through every accusation up to this point had a different quality now. Quieter and more dangerous, the stillness of a man who had just understood that this had never been about the tower at all. This wasn't opportunity, he said. This was designed. Someone built a trap 11 weeks ago with my name already written into the ending. Desmond Voss did not run. That was the detail that would stay with Julian longest. Afterward, when he thought back on the day the truth surfaced in front of everyone who mattered. Desmond didn't run, didn't deny, didn't even raise his voice when Simone laid the audit trail and the facial recognition match on the conference table in front of him at 11 the next morning. He simply looked at both documents for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who had already rehearsed, many times, exactly how he would behave in the moment this conversation finally happened. You're going to want to hear the rest of it before you decide what this means, he said. I know enough, Simone said. You know a badge log and a photograph. You don't know why. Julian stood near the window, arms crossed, saying nothing, because he had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do to a man like Desmond was interrupt him before he finished explaining himself. Men who explained too much always explained past the point where the explanation helped them. Desmond folded his hands on the table. Kestrel Holdings approached me 14 months ago. Advisory position, 7 figures. Contingent on one condition, that Ashford Group's Aurelius financing round collapse before the Meridian Spire opens. He said it the way a man reads a line he has repeated to himself so many times it has stopped sounding like a confession. If the tower opens on schedule, you close the round, you break ground on Tower 2, and Kestrel spends the next decade watching you own the skyline they wanted for themselves. If it doesn't open on schedule, if there's a structural failure, even a minor one, Aurelius walks, your equity value drops, and Kestrel buys a controlling stake at half of what it's worth today. So you built a fault into my building, Simone said, and her voice had gone very quiet, the quiet of someone holding something together by force of will alone. I delayed a schedule. That's all it was supposed to be. A resurfaced weld, a monitoring blind spot, enough to push the opening back 11 weeks without anyone getting hurt. Kestrel's engineer designed the repeater. I didn't understand the full scope of what it was doing to the alerting threshold until it was already installed, and by then you'd already used my name to bury it, Julian said, and it was the first thing he'd said since walking into the room. Desmond looked at him for the first time directly. Roland Ashby suggested it. He said a man with a falsified safety conviction on his record makes a convenient answer if anyone starts asking hard questions about the vibration pattern. He said it would hold up long enough to matter, and he was right about almost everything else, so I didn't push back. Almost everything else, Julian repeated. What did he get wrong? He didn't think you'd find the second device. He said you'd find the weld, take your money, and go home. He didn't account for someone who listens to buildings instead of reading reports about them. The room was silent for a moment. Outside, 40 feet below, a crane rotated slowly against the gray Chicago sky, indifferent to everything happening above it. "There's something you need to understand," Julian said, "about what that repeater actually did. I don't think you understand it, even now." He walked to the laptop at the end of the table, opened the file Priya had prepared overnight, and turned the screen toward Desmond and Simone both. The strain gauge feed on floor 63 doesn't just monitor floor 63. It's part of a network that cross-references load distribution across the entire vertical core from the foundation up. The repeater wasn't just delaying an alert. It was suppressing the building's ability to detect a growing imbalance in how weight moves through that column as the upper floors finish loading in. Right now, today, without that repeater removed, the 60th floor column is absorbing roughly 18% more lateral stress than the design tolerance allows for, and the monitoring system has no idea because it's been told for 11 weeks that everything is within range. Simone's face went pale in a way it hadn't during the entire conversation about betrayal and financing and Kestrel Holdings. 18%. At current occupancy load, that's manageable. Barely. Once residents move in, once the building's actually carrying the weight it was designed to carry, that column fails within a range I'd estimate at 8 to 14 months. Not catastrophically, not all at once. It creeps, the way a crack in a windshield creeps, until one day the load shifts somewhere it shouldn't, and something gives. Desmond had gone quiet, and for the first time since the meeting began, something in his composure actually broke. A fraction, a flicker of a man realizing the full weight of what he had allowed to happen under his signature. "I didn't know it was that serious," he said. "I swear to you, I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Julian said. "That's the part people like you never seem to understand. Not knowing isn't a defense when you had every opportunity to ask and chose the version where you didn't have to." Priya arrived 20 minutes later with the last piece, the piece that turned a corporate betrayal into something the board could not spin, could not manage, could not quietly settle behind closed doors. She'd spent the night pulling Roland Ashby's public filings, cross-referencing them against Corrigan Ashby Consulting's client list for the past 3 years, and found what she was looking for in a footnote buried in a Kestrel Holdings shareholder disclosure from the previous spring. Corrigan Ashby Consulting held a retained advisory contract with Kestrel Holdings, had held it for 6 years, had held it, in fact, during the exact period they'd served as the third-party certifier on the Delacroix pedestrian bridge, the bridge that collapsed, the case that sent Julian to prison for 18 months for a failure that was never his. "They didn't just use a firm connected to Kestrel to frame you now," Priya said, sliding the printout across the table to Julian, her hand not quite steady. "Kestrel's been paying that firm for over a decade, which means the Delacroix case wasn't a coincidence Desmond exploited. It was the same playbook, run once before, and it worked well enough that somebody remembered it existed when they needed a convenient scapegoat again." Julian read the filing twice. He had spent 11 years believing his conviction was a specific injustice, a single bad afternoon in a courtroom where the wrong story won. He had never once considered that it might have been a template, tested and proven, waiting in a drawer somewhere for the next building that needed a fall guy. He set the paper down and didn't say anything for a long moment, and Simone, watching him, understood something about the stillness in his face that she hadn't understood about him until just then. It wasn't calm. It had never been calm. It was the particular discipline of a man who had learned the hard way that the moment you let people see how much something costs you is the moment they start using it against you. "What do you want to do with this?" Simone asked quietly. "I want the weld replaced and the repeater removed before another resident tour walks through this building," Julian said. "I want the load imbalance documented and reported to the city's building safety authority independently of your legal team, so nobody can quietly manage the number down before it goes on record. And I want Roland Ashby's name in that report exactly as it appears in Priya's filing, so the next inspector who finds a convenient scapegoat on a Kestrel-adjacent project knows to look twice." "And Desmond?" Julian looked at the man across the table, who had not moved, who was staring at the folder in front of him with the expression of someone finally doing the arithmetic he had avoided for 14 months. "That's not my decision to make," Julian said. "I'm not interested in what happens to him. I'm interested in whether this building is safe to live in, and whether the next person this firm decides to sacrifice gets a Priya Nakamura willing to pull an audit trail at 9 at night instead of going home." Priya, hearing her own name said that plainly, in that context, looked down at the table, and something in her shoulders loosened for the first time in 6 days. Simone stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the crane still turning below, at the 87 floors of steel that had, until an hour ago, been the proudest thing she'd ever built. "I need to call my father," she said, "and then I need to call the city." She did both, in that order, within the hour, and by the time the sun set over the site, the Meridian Spire had a formal structural hold placed on it by the Chicago Department of Buildings, an independent forensic engineering team retained at Ashford Group's expense, and a name in a preliminary incident report that had nothing to do with Julian Reyes.